All right, let's head over to the Zoom line. Mr. Kent Williamson on the horn with us here. How you doing today, sir?
Doing great.
I
Thank you
should
for
say
having me on,
author
Jason.
Kent Williamson. He's the author of American Heat Engine. Going to get in that just a second. Looks like there's a byline there that says Hydrocarbons and the Power of the United States. So we'll talk about that book a little bit later on. And those people watching the video, he just pointed to the jacket, the cover of the book. And I'm a magazine guy. I started in the newspaper industry when I was 10 years old. Got in the magazine business when I was 21, and been in the media, 45 years of my life. And being a author, not a writer, not a journalist, but being an author carries a whole different set of awards and circumstances and time and context. And we'll get into that in a moment or two because that's incredible work. Congratulations on that. Let's talk about your
Thank
background
you.
first, because in order to write a book, you got to know what you're talking about. So let's find out what Mr. Kent Williamson is all about, and we'll see what that leads to. A spoiler alert, the word hydrocarbon was in the title, so I think I know where this is going. Where are you from, good sir? Where are you from?
Well, I grew up in Colorado, so and
Which part?
in the Denver area, Littleton. So if you look at my bio on the book, it was near Coal Mine Road in Littleton, and it turns out there actually were coal mines out there near where I lived decades before. So, but when I was growing up, I didn't really make that connection till later. So interesting, but so that's my dad's side of the family goes back quite a ways in Colorado to the 1800s. But as I mentioned to you, you being from North Dakota, which is I'm really excited to talk to you because I love talking to folks from North Dakota. My mom's side of the family is from North Dakota. So my
Do you
mom
know
grew up
which part?
in Hebron, North Dakota. So
Oh, that's brick country. Hebron brick country
yes,
there.
yeah,
Yeah, a good friend of mine, his mother married into the family a number of years ago.
right.
Yeah, and so every time I drive by Hebron Brick, of course, I think of that and their gorgeous house that's made out of brick. Also, for those people who are wondering, Hebron is just west of Bismarck, in between
Yes.
Bismarck and Dickinson, North Dakota. Dickinson is right on the southern edge of the Bakken shale play, if you will. And then those people wondering where Littleton, Colorado is, I would say, and correct me if I'm wrong, Kent, but it would be between Denver and Greeley.
No, it's southwest of Denver.
It is southwest of
It's just a
Denver.
suburb. So yeah, basically,
I must be thinking, is it Centennial? Is it between? Okay, I'm thinking of something else that's in
I
between
think you might
Denver
be
and
thinking of Longmont and Loveland.
Longmont. Thank you.
Yes.
Longmont was the one I was thinking of. My apologies, people. So, where is Littleton then, geographically to Denver? Southwest?
Southwest, yes.
Okay, how far southwest do you think?
It's just a suburb.
Oh, a
So
stone's throw. Okay, not
yeah,
as far as like Castle Rock or anything like that.
no, it's kind of between Denver and Castle Rock.
Okay, okay. All right. So, mom grew up in North Dakota. Dad grew up in Colorado. You're more of a Western kind of, I would say, Western agriculture background almost. It seems like
Yeah.
from geography standpoint. When did oil into your life? For me, it wasn't until 15 years ago because I'm from North Dakota. We didn't have oil since the 50s. So, you know, hey man, James Dean drove into town with the movie Giant in his back pocket. So I was
Yeah.
North Dakota. When did it come into your life?
Well, also was a little bit later in my life, but looking back, so back to my family history, my dad actually grew up in primarily in South Dakota. His family is from Colorado. My grandfather was a penny store manager, J.C. Penney, back when J.C. Penney had the little small town stores. So they moved all over. And my grandfather, after World War II, he was in the Navy. Shortly after World War II, in 1946, he got moved to Hebron and they ended up living right next door to my mom's family. So in the late 40s, when they were just in grade school, they lived next door to each other and they would walk to school together. And then later on, a couple years later, they moved to Hot Springs, South Dakota, which is where my dad ended up, graduating from high school. But the family stayed in touch. And then later on, when my dad was in the Navy in California, my mom actually, she went to Dickinson State and became a teacher. And she ended up going out to California in the mid 60s to teach in Corona. And then they reconnected and ended up getting married. So that's kind of how that all went. But my grandmother was a journalist like you. She worked for the Hebron Herald for years, and she ended up writing several books on our family heritage in her 70s and 80s. So in the 80s and 90s, she wrote, and I've got them back here. This was the first one, Homesteading on the Knife River Prairies. So they are Germans from Russia. And so she wrote all about that and really interesting stuff. And she was a great lady. She was actually born 2 months premature in a sod house in North Dakota in 1911. And they didn't think she was going to make it. And she did. And then she ended up living almost to 100. So I learned a lot from her, and she inspired quite a bit of that. And then my grandfather on my mother's side, they had a farm southwest of Hebron, kind of south of Antelope, and we would go out there. So they had to move out off the farm in the 40s because my uncle had really bad asthma. So they moved to Hebron, and my grandfather started a livestock hauling business. And so he was a true cowboy. He had the cowboy boots and the Wranglers and loved rodeos, and he would haul livestock all over North Dakota, Montana, South Dakota, and so forth.
And which
But
town was this livestock business in?
Hebron,
Oh, it was in Hebron. Okay.
yeah,
All right.
yeah, that's where they lived starting in it was 19 mid 40s. That's where my mom
Okay.
grew up, and then yeah, they we would still when we went up to North Dakota every summer, to visit, and they would go out to the old family farm. They still owned the land and leased it to local farmers, but he would show us this coal mine near their house. It was on a creek bed. So that's where he had to dig coal out of the ground, lignite, when he was a boy, and they would use it to heat their home, and then they would sell it to local schools and stuff like that. So it was like, wow, that's pretty amazing. But I mean, of course, I didn't understand as a younger guy what that meant, but it was like, looking back, they didn't have electricity, no natural gas, no propane, nothing. I mean, I suppose they could get wood from somewhere, but as you know, Western North Dakota, there's not a lot of trees, so coal was like a lifesaver. So I thought, that was pretty interesting.
Are you a writer?
No, I mean,
You
I have not really ever been a writer.
you
I went
pointed
in,
to another book, so
well, so that's my grandmother's book.
okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
so that was part of what inspired me. She wrote a few books about our family heritage, later in her life.
I see. Well, the
She
only
was,
reason I bring that up was an attempt to segue into a thought I had, which was that I've often thought about this because my background is media. I mean,
uh
I started getting published as a writer when I was 16. I started getting the magazine business when I was 21. I started in radio when I was 18, and so I've been around this for a long time. And what I found very interesting about my perspective from the oil and gas industry is that the generation below me really likes to quote people. So they like to take other people's work and present it as their own and do it in all these different ways. And one of the ways they like to do it is to say, hey, look at this famous quote from Mark Twain. Hey, look at this famous quote from this successful person, Henry Ford. And when I see these quotes come out, I always think to myself, like, 90% of these people didn't even have hot water. Like, warm showers aren't even a thing.
yeah,
The 1950s brought in warm showers. And here you are talking about your family in the 40s, didn't even, they're out digging coal in their backyard like people in Alaska and Africa currently are
yeah.
today. I mean, people in Africa are doing more of the cow and buffalo dung to burn, and which is
Yeah.
true. In Alaska, a lot of people still they'll go on the shoreline and grab a big chunk of coal and throw it in the coal fire, and that sort of thing. But anyway, to me, it's a way to take a step back and realize that a lot of greatness came before people had running water that was hot and
Yeah.
that sort of thing. And so um it's a moment to transition into your perspective, I guess, on what coal and gas and oil to that perspective brought into your family tree. Because
Yes.
I mean, you saw it right before your eyes, man. I mean, for
Yep.
me, I came from the agriculture side, Candioi County, Minnesota. So I watched from water go from orange to white. I mean, when they
Yep.
started pulling iron out of the water because all of us kids got sick and stuff like that. So
Yeah.
we were guinea pigs. So what was your perspective on just the industry being folded into your family tree?
Well, as far as agriculture goes, so my uncle, so my mom's older sister, her husband, he got called on. He was a heavy equipment operator. And I remember as a kid, they lived in Bismarck and Grand Forks, and he was working on the overpasses for I-94. He was a crane operator. So I thought he was really cool. He let us get into the crane a couple of times when we went up to visit. But anyway, in the mid 70s, he got asked to go back to their family farm and run it. And it was near Hebron as well. And so we got to go up there for a few summers in the 70s. And I was just a young kid, and that was just so cool. But I remember all the tractors and all the equipment. And then they had the big diesel tank out there, they would refuel. I thought that was pretty cool. They had a gas station right on the farm and all that. But then for family reasons in the late 70s, he ended up having to move off the farm, and they moved down to Rapid City, South Dakota, and he bought a service station. At the time, it was mobile, and then it later moved over to Sinclair. And my cousin, Jim Bookley, still owns it it's on Rushmore Road in Rapid City. So if anyone listening is ever in Rapid City, please stop by and see my cousin Jim Bookley at the Sinclair station. But yeah, I mean, that service station's been in our family for so many years, and I thought it was really neat. He showed me how the pumps worked and all that kind of stuff. And they would I don't know, about the motorcycle rally in Sturgis, and when those things would go on, they just get streams of motorcycles coming into the station. So
And
I
where is the service station? You said Rapid City?
yes, right on Rushmore Road.
Okay, well that's a very popular road.
Yeah.
For those folks that are wondering about, the Black Hills where we're talking about, for me, I've always had a spiritual connection to the Black Hills. I've absolutely loved it since I was a kid. I actually go out there like quarterly because
All
I
right.
really enjoy it. And I love staying in hot springs and spearfish. And it's so funny because if you're not from the Black Hills and if you go to hot springs and then you go to spearfish, you think you're in the Twilight Zone because you've never seen two communities that are so different from one another, yet have so many similarities. And they both do things their own way. And
Yeah.
it's nothing like you outside of the Black Hills. Like Spearfish has its own vibe up there, especially with the trout hatchery and all the vibe they're trying to get going. Then you go down to Hot Springs, and that's a whole different deal there. And then
Yeah.
right in the middle, they're doing the biggest science project known to man, where they're trying to split the atom, or I don't know, recreate the Big Bang theory, whatever they're trying to do with the was it and lead and lead or lead, depending on if you're Surrey or if you're Alexa. they
Yeah.
they mispronounce it, but anyways, I actually would like to retire in the Black Hills.
Yeah.
I've always wanted to, and along those lines, do you still go back there, or is it just the family service station that you still?
Well, so yeah, my aunt and uncle are in their 90s now, and they still live in Rapid City. So they're
Okay.
retired, but my cousin still lives there. And so we go back. I've taken my mom back there a couple times, and then, but yeah, like I mentioned, my dad grew up in Hot Springs, so we used to get up there quite a bit just to visit. I remember, I don't know if you've been to Evans Plunge. That was
Oh yeah.
the I loved going there as a kid. That was so cool with the the hot springs water there, and then
Hmm.
water slides and the rings that you'd swing on and all that stuff. So
We'd go there and Thermopolis. We'd go to
yeah,
Thermopolis, Wyoming, which is a lot like Hot Springs, to where they take advantage of the hot springs, so they have a little bath area and that kind of thing. I think Craig call is it Craig or Hot Steamboat Springs? Maybe they've got something like that in Colorado too. But anyway, this isn't AAA, folks. This is Barnes and Noble and Amazon, and so we're talking about the book American Heat Engine. Kent Williamson is the author. And is this your first book?
yes.
How long did it take? And let's talk about the process a little bit before we get into the book itself. So, without writing another book, tell me about the process it took to get through this one.
Yeah, so I mean, fast forward in my career. So I went into the military. I was in the Marines for a number of years, and then I got out, went to into the business world, and about 20 years ago, I ended up I found Dan Jurgens the prize in a bookstore.
Now, what is that?
That's the history of the oil industry.
Okay, I've
So
never seen that book or heard of that book before.
yeah, so it was published about 30 years ago in the early 90s. And I had
Okay.
never heard of it, but it's a really good book. Now it's like 800 pages long. But anyway, I looked up Dan Jurgen, and then one thing led to another, and I ended up getting a job in 2007 here in Tulsa with IHS. And IHS happened to be based in Colorado, which is where I grew up. And I had never heard of it. So I started applying for jobs, and they acquired a small geology software company here in Tulsa, and they needed a product manager. And they wanted geology and oil and gas experience. I didn't have that. I had product management experience from previous jobs and leadership from the military and so forth. So I applied, and one thing led to another, and I got hired in 2007. And little did I know, that's right when the unconventional revolution was really getting going, mainly on the natural gas side at that point, the Barnett Shale, the Haynesville, and all that. The oil, the Bakken was still in very early stages. And, but this software that I was the product manager for was called Petra, and it's still in existence. They, it was used by practically every oil company in the United States. And so I had a front row seat to the unconventional revolution for 4 years. And then I ended up moving up to Colorado, which is where our headquarters were. And we acquired some chemical consulting businesses. So I learned all about the petrochemical industry and how it was being rejuvenated by the, unconventional natural gas and NGL production. I ended up in a research role. So I did refining and marketing Latin America, and I learned about how closely tied the United States and Latin America are as far as, crude imports to the United States, refined product and NGL exports to Latin America, and so forth. So really fascinating stuff, and a whole bunch of other stuff. Biofuels. I learned about coal. I spoke at a coal conference in Colombia one time. So 15 years to this company. And then we ended up moving back to Tulsa about 5 years ago. My wife is from here. She's an attorney, and she had some job opportunities. I was kind of working remote, even before the pandemic. So I was able to move back here. And then one thing led to another, and we merged with S&P Global in 2022. S&P, like the S&P 500 and so forth. But anyway, I ended up having an opportunity to move on, and I was kind of ready to do something different. I loved the company, good 15 great years, but my wife had a really intense job. And then I had started thinking about, doing something else, including writing this book. So through this journey, I learned all about the energy industry, which I knew some things about it, but I didn't really know a lot about it. And I just, as I learned more and more, I was like, man, I took this totally for granted. And very few of us really learn about it growing up, unless you're like in the industry or your parents are in it or whatever. So I was like, I took this totally for granted, and it's really important. And I also love history, especially American history. And I kind of started looking around, and I just, I found that there's not really a lot. There's no book on the history of hydrocarbons, coal, oil, and natural gas in the United States. And so I thought, well, maybe I can write something. I actually started on the concept of mineral rights. So back to my first job with IHS, this Petra software could handle like millions of wells. The United States, we have probably over 5 million wells that have been drilled.
Hmm.
And I asked people from the industry, why is that? And part of the reason is because we're pretty much the only country in the world that has private mineral rights. And that has led to some of the dynamism in especially our oil and gas industry. So I got interested in that, but I found that was a bit too academic and you know complex for me. So then I just said, hey, let me try to write a general history of hydrocarbons in America. And that was kind of another unique aspect is usually histories are one of the hydrocarbons. So they're about oil, like Dan Jurgens Prize book, and then or natural gas or coal, but not all three. And as I researched it, I found they're all very much interrelated in a lot of ways that I didn't know. And so I thought it was really fascinating. So, and then what I tried to do is I also wanted to make it, I think people are they're reading less and less these days because of all the different distractions, phones, videos, cable TV, and computers and all that. So, the appetite for a huge long book is not there. So another book that really inspired me was this An Empire of Wealth, The Epic History of American Economic Power by John Steele Gordon. It's about 20 years old, but he wrote it. There's no charts or graphs or anything. He just tried to write a real interesting narrative on the U.S. economic history. And so I kind of modeled my book a little bit after that. And it's a little over 100,000 words and about 300 pages. And I've tried to write it in a way that's interesting and it covers the topic, but it's not like an academic textbook or an encyclopedia. And I'm hoping, and I've found so far the reception, even people that have no industry background are able to understand it. So that's kind of the process.
When you talk about the hydrocarbons and the power of the United States, is it get into politics at all? Is there a layer of it? Because it's almost impossible to discuss oil and gas without having some infusion of politics at some point.
Yeah, so it's not meant to be a political statement like, oil and gas and coal are good, hydrocarbons are good, and everything else is bad. It's really just meant to be a history of hydrocarbons in the United States, but pointing out that they have been integral to the growth and ultimately the power of the United States. So,
But what you just said is almost contradiction to each other because you you can't have a history of the United States really without being net positive for coal, oil,
yes,
and gas. And so by doing that, it's automatically a political statement at that point, whether you like it or not. And that's
yeah, I guess you
sad.
could say that.
Yeah, it's a sad thing because, and I bring this up a lot because when I grew up, the oil and gas industry was not political at all.
Yeah.
Occasionally, you'd hear gas prices
Hmm.
as a debate topic at Thanksgiving and the dinner tables, but it was never an issue. Now, I mean, and I grew up primarily, we're talking Clinton years, Bill Clinton years, you know what I mean? And so,
Yeah.
NAFTA and all these different things. Now, in the last 10 to 15 years, it's gotten so polarizing
Yeah.
that that people are, in their mind, they're not able to just have logical thoughts. They're
Yeah.
not able to have rational discussions. And you're from the industry, so I'm not sure if you saw it coming or you saw an evolution of it, but what is the reaction and reception to your book, and how do you respond to, the comment I just made about kind of the evolution of the polarization of the industry?
Well, I mean, it's the book is definitely pro hydrocarbon. I mean, and it's pro United States. So, if that's a political statement, I guess you can say that is, and it does focus on the good that hydrocarbons have done for the United States and by extension for the world. And part of that I learned, I don't know if you know Alex Epstein. Yeah, he wrote
Oh
wrote
yeah.
the moral case for fossil fuels, which I listened to years ago, and I thought that was really interesting. And he frames things, very well about how, various subjects, but hydrocarbons especially, everyone seems to focus mainly on the negative side effects. And there are problems, pollution, other issues, the safety and so forth. But the good that they've done far outweighs bad, at least in my opinion. And that's part of what I tried to show with this book. It does focus on the positive. I do mention some of the issues side, but I don't fixate on those. It's focused on the positive but I guess it goes back to the hydrocarbons have played a huge role in American history, and they've been very important in the development of the United States economically, industrially, and militarily. And I don't think people realize how important they've been. So that's part of why I wanted to write the book to illustrate that. And the United States has become the most powerful country in the history of the world. Well, that's not an accident. And, it's the people first, the American people, of course, but hydrocarbons have enabled the American people to build this powerful country. And, you just kind of see this stuff and take it for granted. So I guess as an example, these B-2 strikes on Iran, a month or so ago now. And it kind of gets taken for granted, but the ability to project power across the globe like that is not, we're pretty much the only country that can do that. And the fact that do it, I mean, those B-2s are really high speed and so forth, but they still run on good old-fashioned jet fuel, and they have to be refueled by old-fashioned tankers to get, over there and back. And, as you know, jet fuel is refined from petroleum, and it just doesn't appear by magic. So all that kind of stuff, the ships that we have over in the Middle East or elsewhere off China, we do have nuclear aircraft carriers and submarines, but most of the ships are still powered on a form of fuel oil. And then, the aircraft use the jet fuel, and vehicles use diesel and so forth. So all that interesting stuff. So I just think it's a really interesting topic that hasn't been covered in this way, and the interrelationships between the hydrocarbons and so forth. So,
One
and
of the aspects I find interesting about the oil and gas industry, and it is backed up by science, is that I've said this for quite a long time, and I come from the ag industry,
mhm,
which was considered the most dangerous industry by a mile that
yeah,
no one ever talked about. Like if you take a look at the highest death rates by industry, the ag industry was number one forever. I mean, springs going out and augers going into people,
yes,
and tractor roll, and a lot of tractor rollovers were considered automobile accidents in the statistics. So
yeah,
they didn't even get counted. I mean, I was in a dozen three-wheeler accidents. I mean, I think I funded a separate wing to the hospital just on my three-wheeler accidents from the 80s. So, we're taking a look at the different, industries. When I got into the oil and gas industry, I came from a journalism standpoint, and so I didn't know anything about the industry. I actually thought I was going to probably end up writing against the industry.
yeah,
I was going to be some environmental writer, at the end of the day. But I don't write on skydiving unless I go skydiving. Okay, so I'm a method journalist. So I embedded myself out in the industry. And what I saw very quickly was that the industry was actually the leader in saving
yeah,
the planet. They weren't the leaders in polluting the planet. They were actually the leaders in saving the
Yeah.
planet because of their environmental innovation. In the same way the defense contracts gave us the microwave, the oil and gas industry has given us more environmental innovations than we can shake a stick at. And the fact that none of that is getting talked about or getting really discussed is problematic for me. And that's one of the reasons we started the Crude Life, was because yeah, there's some of the negative going on. I've been an ag, I get all that. But man, look at all that positive.
Yeah.
I mean, you guys talk about agriculture feeding the world. Well, these guys are saving the planet. I
Yeah.
mean, my goodness. I mean, the farmers are killing the planet more than oil and gas are. Take a look at the dead zone, excuse me. So you see, now I can get political too here, but so that was my perspective, was that I actually saw the industry saving the planet more than killing it. Does your book get into that environmental
Yeah.
side of things? Talk to me about that a little bit.
So you mentioned agriculture. So one part of the book covers the revolution in nitrogen fertilizers, the Haber-Bosch process, and a lot of that took place in the United States, and it was linked to, in part, to explosives. So toluene for TNT for explosives during World War I and World War II. That flowed into nitrogen fertilizers, and you're probably well aware the nitrogen fertilizers really took off at post World War II, and we had the Norman Borlaug, with the Green Revolution, and huge increases in yields, and feeding the 7-8 billion people on the earth simply not possible without nitrogen fertilizers, and that's enabled by hydrocarbons, especially natural gas. So that's a big factor, and improving yields allows you to produce more food from less land. So there's actually been an increase in decreasing the amount of land that's needed to produce more food, which is good for the environment, and to allow you to rotate crops, let more land lay fallow for a while, rejuvenate, and then use it. So that's one illustration. Another illustration is coal. So a lot of I talk about how early iron production was based on charcoal. So to smelt iron out of the iron ore, you have to use a hydrocarbon, and charcoal was used initially based on wood. So wood was burned in the absence of oxygen to create charcoal. Charcoal is used to smelt iron. And in the early United States iron industry, which they had learned from the British had started using coal much earlier because they had cut down all their forests. So in the colonial United States, of course, the entire eastern seaboard is covered by forests. So they had plenty of wood and plenty of water power for smelting iron. So it stayed charcoal base for a long time. But then, of course, we have a lot of coal, and over time, coal became used for smelting iron and the iron and steel industries, and that's been good for the forests. So I'm also kind of a military history buff. I love the Civil War, and I always point out if you go to Civil War battlefields and go to the museums and look at the old photos of those battlefields, they usually have very few trees in them. So if you go to the battlefields now, there's huge trees all over the place. Back then, they were all mostly cut down because they used it for agriculture and so forth, and for other for heating and cooking in homes, and in some cases charcoal for iron smelting. So the fact that we used coal for substituted coal for wood in all these applications, steam engines, smelting iron and so forth, that allowed the forests, especially in the East and the Midwest, to rejuvenate. And then, of course, the famous example for oil is the whales. So oil saved the whales. Illumination, the American oil industry, and really the world oil industry, started basically in 1859, Titusville. And the main product for basically the rest of the 1800s was kerosene for lamp oil. And, you know, that's another thing I think people don't realize. For most of human history, when the sun went down, you went into the dark. you could have a little fire in your fireplace or wherever that provided a little bit of light, but candles and things like that and lamps didn't come till later, and they were pretty expensive. Most people couldn't afford them. So think about that, especially like in a northern latitude in the winter, the sun goes down and at 4 or 5 in the afternoon and you're in the dark. So the demand for illumination was huge, and kerosene really changed the game. But one of the main lamp fuels at the time was whale oil from various types of whales, including sperm whales. And we all know whales were hunted almost to extinction in the 1800s, partially because of their use in lamp oil, and kerosene from petroleum changed all that. So there's been a lot of environmental benefits to hydrocarbons. I've seen there's one book that I actually haven't read, but it was called The Subterranean Forest about coal. And that's really what coal is. It's just a forest that, plant matter and so forth that got buried and turned into coal. And it's much more energy dense and in often cases more cleaner burning than wood. So the progression of energy density is really interesting too. So those are a few examples. I think there's others that you could point out as well.
How's the industry accepting the book, and how's the public accepting the book, and everything else? I mean, it's a very niche topic, and it's even when judging a book by by its cover, you're obviously even appealing to a more technical minded individual, which is the oil and gas industry. So my guess is, your primary target customer would be somebody in the oil and gas industry. Secondary would be somebody involved with American history and just culture, I guess. Somebody
Yeah.
who appreciates the evolution of culture. Who is your target customer, and how is just the friends, family, colleagues, that sort of thing? How's it being received?
It's been received well so far. I mean, so I'm a self-publisher, so I just I work directly with editors and other book designer and so forth. And then I've just put it on Amazon, so it's in a paperback, print on demand, and an ebook. So I may expand that in the future, but I'm pretty much it as far as marketing. And so these kind of opportunities to talk to people like really help, because I've had people learn about it. I was on a couple other podcasts earlier. So yeah, I've sold a few copies, and I just continue to chip away. And the people that have read it, there is some people that are in the industry, and there's some people that really had no knowledge of it. And part of my goal with writing the book was actually to write it in such a way that, one, it would appeal to people in the industry, but it would have some things that they probably weren't aware of, and that's been confirmed to me. But two, I did want to try to expand the audience out to people that are not familiar with hydrocarbons, because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding or just lack of understanding because it's really not covered in our education system. It's kind of taken for granted. And then there's a lot of, as you've mentioned, we've talked about, there's a lot of negative stuff that's kind of overblown. And so people have a kind of a skewed understanding of the industry. So I wanted to write this book in a way to make it easy for people to understand. And I think I've succeeded. I've had a few people tell me, that have read it, they weren't really familiar with the industry, or at least all of the the three hydrocarbons, and they found it really fascinating and uh, easy to understand. And then people within the industry have told me, yeah, I know a lot about this and this aspect, but I didn't know about this, which you talked about in your book. So pretty interesting.
What was the biggest surprise from the book, either from your perspective or from the reader's perspective?
Well, for me, it's the interrelationships between the hydrocarbons were fascinating
What do you
because,
mean by that?
well,
That's an
so
odd statement. I've never heard that before.
yeah, I mean, because coal, so when I was with IHS for those years, I was mainly on kind of the oil and natural gas side. So I learned more about that. We did have coal experts, and I talked to them and I learned a few things about coal, but obviously coal is quite a bit of different industry. It's mined and oil and gas is drilled for and so forth. And there are different phases, solid, liquid,
Hmm.
gas, and all that. But you know, what was fascinating was how intertwined they've been, especially historically, but even to this day. So one example I can give is I don't know, have you ever heard of manufactured gas?
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's, before electric lighting and during the era of lamps and candles and things like that, they figured out in the late 1700s, early 1800s, again, it came primarily from Britain, how to use coal and other substances to generate a gas that would burn. It was a low heating value gas, but it would burn and provide lighting. So gas lights. So now we call it, we call the kind of the slang term gaslighting people, but there actually
I,
were,
by the way, I've never put that together till right now.
yeah,
That manufactured gas was what gaslighting was, and so
yeah,
therefore, you're manufacture. So when you're gaslighting somebody, you're manufacturing their reality. Oh, that's
yeah,
brilliant. That's brilliant.
yeah.
Okay. Anyways,
So,
sorry.
but yeah,
Love it.
that's in the early 1800s. So here in the United States, it was 1816. These portrait guys that had a museum. So Rembrandt Peale, who he painted various portraits, including of George Washington.
Was he related to the Rembrandt of Rembrandt frame?
I don't know, I don't think so, but
Okay.
they opened a museum in Baltimore, and they had done some experimenting with gaslighting in Pennsylvania. So they opened this thing and they built a gaslight system. It was actually not based on coal; it was based on like pine tar or something like that. But they they basically cooked this pine tar and they built some pipes and they had gas lights in this museum. Well, the gas lights ended up being the big attraction. People didn't really care so much about the portraits and stuff. They thought the gas lights were cool. And then from that they ended up building a little gas utility in Baltimore. Now Rembrandt Peale ended up getting kind of pushed out of the business, but that was like the first gas utility, and so gas lighting spread around the country through the 1800s. Now, it was primarily in bigger cities, and you had to have pretty big plants that it migrated mainly to coal. So you would use coal and burn the coal, generate a gas, and then they ran pipes. So that formed the backbone of the natural gas industry, the natural gas utilities that we're familiar with today. And so that's an example of an interrelationship between coal and natural gas. So natural gas ends up coming in later in the 1800s and starts replacing coal-based manufactured gas because natural gas has higher heating value and other advantages to it. So one of the problems, of course, with coal-based manufactured gas is you had to have these huge gas they were called gas houses. So you may have heard that term, gas house gangs. And
Hmm.
they were right in the cities, and burning that much coal and then disposing of the waste has led to there's a lot of these gas plant sites that are still EPA cleanup sites in various cities. They go because they didn't obviously they didn't know, or I'm sure there was some negligence and stuff. They would just dump this stuff onto a vacant lot next to their plant or whatever. What's interesting is some of the residue from these gas plants, coal tar, that formed the basis of the modern petrochemical industry. So they started extracting certain things like dyes and other things from coal tar. And then once petroleum came in, uh, petrochemicals, some of those techniques they'd used in coal tar translated into the petrochemical industry. So kind of another interrelationship. So all those kind of things, really fascinating.
What's the biggest takeaway you want people to get from this?
Well, that hydrocarbons, it's a important part of American history, and I think we should be proud of it. I mean, it's as Americans. Now, there's several people that have already read the book that are not Americans, and they found it interesting as well. And it's kind of eye-opening as to, how did the United States become so powerful? And hydrocarbons are a huge reason why. And it continues to this day. It's not not by accident. And even the imported hydrocarbons, primarily we've imported oil. And you and I were well aware that we imported a lot, especially the latter half of the 20th century, and we're entangled in the Middle East and all that. And that reduction in reliance on the Middle East partially has come about because of the unconventional revolution. We're producing more from shale and so forth, and then we're importing a lot more from Canada, which I point out in the book as well. The heavy sour crude that we get from Latin America and Canada, those are the bulk of our imports now. So they're from closer by, they're from more friendly countries, and so forth. But at the end of the day, it seems that the world still needs the United States to kind of keep the peace in various places around the world. And you know, the hydrocarbons that we produce and the ones that we safeguard elsewhere around the world are really important to that. So I point out with coal, coal is kind of the redheaded stepchild of the hydrocarbons these days. No one wants it around anymore. It seems to be making a bit of a comeback under the current administration, and there are different ways that it's being used. But we still generate 15% of our electricity from coal, and it's critical for steel making, which we still do in the United States. And we also export a lot of it. So a couple of years ago, we exported coal to like over 70 countries in the world. So it's still pretty important. And, the United States, the fact that we still produce a lot of hydrocarbons, we use it in a variety of ways for power generation, for transportation fuel, for petrochemicals, for fertilizer, and others. And that the fact that we export it and the fact that we are able to project power globally through the Navy and other military forces, economic influence, and so forth, and kind of keep the peace, keep things stable, I think is pretty important. So, but it's really just interesting. I find it fascinating. I'm kind of a hydrocarbon geek, and I just hope people, read the book and find it as interesting, or at least partially as interesting as I do.
If someone's going to buy this as a gift for somebody, I mean, I imagine it's probably not the best, gift for a kid graduating high school, but who knows, to each their own type of a thing. But who would you recommend if someone were to buy this for a gift for someone?
I mean, it can run the gamut. I mean, as you mentioned, people that just like history and American history, it's a topic that really isn't covered very much in history. So, I explain in the book, I went back, I still have my old high school history textbook, American history, and, I have a lot of other American history books, and it's always kind of glazed over. And I'm not criticizing with that. It is kind of a top, it can be boring, and it can be very technical and so forth, but I've just found that it's really not covered. There are a lot of good books and other resources on specific eras or specific hydrocarbons in different places. But, as far as a general history of hydrocarbons in the United States, this is the only one that's out there. So if you have someone that likes history, especially American history, and want to give them something that's a little bit different, this is a great book for that. Another thing I would say is people that, someone who's in the industry may know a family or a friend that, has a lot of misconceptions about hydrocarbons, oil and gas or coal, or they may even be hostile. We need to get rid of it. We need to have the energy transition, so forth. You might want to give them the book and say, hey, well, here's a history of it. At least understand, how the background and why it's so important and why we still get over 80% of our energy from hydrocarbons in the United States, despite trying to transition away from them for quite a while now. So
And where can somebody pick it up again?
Amazon. So it's just Amazon. Like I said, a paperback. It's 17.75. So I priced it like that because this year, 2025, is the 250th anniversary of the start of the American Revolution in Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts in April. So I just did a social media post a week or so ago. George Washington took command of the Continental Army in July 3rd of 1775 in Cambridge, Massachusetts. But I pointed out George Washington was well aware of hydrocarbons. He had seen coal when he was in Western Pennsylvania and elsewhere during the French and Indian War in the 1750s. His home state of Virginia is actually the site of the first commercially exploited coal mine in the United States in the late 1600s, early 1700s. There was a coal field outside of Richmond. I don't know if Washington was specifically aware of that one, but then Washington also owned land in modern day West Virginia, including the town of Burning Springs, where he had been out and noted naturally burning springs. They were either natural oil or natural gas seeps that had been ignited by lightning or by people. The Native Americans had long noted these springs in the Appalachian area. So George Washington was well aware of American hydrocarbons and knew of the potential. So I also have an ebook on Amazon. So if you don't want the physical book, just put it on your phone or tablet or whatever, you can get that. And that's $7.75. So
Of course, we'll have the links here on the show page for this podcast as well. And for anybody out there who's a history buff, I invite you to sign up for the Crude Life for our Petro Playback, which is a daily kind of a playback day in history. We also put a product that's made by Petroleum Products. We just today have added the daily news headlines too. So now, and I'm behind, our fence blew off from a storm we had come through. And so I had to put it, I've been kind of big panel about, I don't know, probably about a 10-foot panel of, the dog-eared fences. 6-foot privacy fences. And so I got dogs coming in my backyard and my dog's leaving the backyard. And so I haven't got the Petro Playback up yet, but it's July 11th today. And the very first gas station in U.S. history opened their doors today, 1911. I think maybe it was July 11th and not 1911. Anyways.
I think you said it was 1913.
1913, thank you.
I read that one. I thought that was really
after
cool.
I said it, I'm going, no, it wasn't 1911. It was July 11th, but 19-something. So 19-3, we'll say that. And it was Gulf Oil in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And so if you ever need a reason to call is it your cousin that owns a gas station? Your uncle? In Rapid City, South Dakota. Today's the day to wish him happy gas station day, whether it is or not. I'm officially calling that, but check it out, folks. I think if you like history, you'll like the Petro Playback. We're getting some great response. We started it in June as a new feature, a daily feature, because, doing these interviews, I'd like to do one weekly, a couple a week, that type of thing. But I used to do these, for a living. And then Joe Rogan came out and everybody wants to do a 3-4 hour podcast now. Well, man, that's a lot of time. And in the oil and gas industry, not everybody has that time. However, what I found is that the half hour to hour interviews, they work really well in the oil and gas industry, because if you're a CEO or if you're an HR or you're a roustabout or a rig hand, you still got to drive 3 hours to that rig. I don't care who you are. That rig is still 3 hours away. And so, and a lot of times you ain't going to get any radio stations. So you're listening to these podcasts and ones that can have a little bit of depth and also not so much trigger words and polarizing talk, and people like to learn something. And so, I appreciate you coming on here and being a part of this. And I'm sure you'd be a big fan of the Petro Playback, right up your alley. Oh, you are? Or you do
Yeah,
subscribe? Okay,
I think they're
great.
great, and I'd encourage all your listeners to check them out. They're really interesting. So,
I've learned I actually prepare them because I'm an old school editor. I'm a former publisher, and so for me, I enjoy this. Like I still take the trash out. Okay, I mean, like I'm chief bottle washer,
yeah,
at our place, and so I actually like doing these mostly because I want to make sure I get the template down before I hand it off to some high school kid
yeah,
that hopefully I can hire because I want the youth to get invested in the industry. And the only way I can really see them is to have them do the petrol playback so they come to me and say, hey, did you realize in this day that BP bought Vasquez and they went into,
yeah,
I mean, I'd love to. Can you imagine having those conversations with kids in today's day and age? So
yeah.
if somebody wants to sponsor the petrol playback, it's going to go to a high school kid or a college kid. That's where the money's going. It ain't going to my pockets, folks. That money's going right to job creation, and it's going to, and you see what it is. This is entry level work we're talking about here. That's why I'm doing it right now, because
Yeah.
it needs to be done right, because that, as well as I do, it takes a bunch of bricks in order to make a castle smooth and safe and sound and that sort of thing, going back to the Hebron brick comments from earlier.
Yeah.
So anyways, any final thoughts, anything that we left out, anything you want to make sure that people get about this before we wish you a good day and get people excited to buy this book?
I think you said it best, and like I said, I find your petro playbacks really interesting, and I think the history of hydrocarbons in general and in the United States especially is really interesting, and that's one of the reasons I wrote this book. And I hope people will check it out and find that as well, and also read your petro playback because yeah, I mean it's an area that people haven't really thought about, but it's really a fascinating subject that it touches on so many different aspects of our lives and our history, industrial, agricultural, cultural. I mean, lighting, heating, cooking uh, flows into that. The comforts of home, the ability to move about and travel and fly places, things, all that type of thing. And then, military power, industrial power, trade, geopolitics. It's really a fascinating subject. And there's so many interesting little tidbits. You mentioned the gas station. I was passing through Chandler, Oklahoma. It's between here and Tulsa and Oklahoma City. And they have a really cool bowling alley that has all these old gas station brand signs. And from the familiar ones like Conoco and Phillips 66 to old ones that no longer exist. It's really cool. So, and I know I see that stuff online. There's people that hunt that stuff down and trade it and buy vintage signs and so forth. So
So like,
interesting stuff.
I mentioned that I do the petrol playback, that I prepare it and, go look at what it was in history and pick some things and that sort of thing. And, it takes me more time than it should because I enjoy it. You know what I mean? It's kind of like,
Yeah,
it could probably take me 5 minutes, but a half hour later, I'm like, oh, dang it. Why did I pick that one? I should have picked this other one and that sort of thing, and today, the very first gas station, and then I went to the American History Museum archives in order to grab a photograph, right? Because I try to get public domain photos when I can and that sort of thing. And being a former magazine publisher, I know how to do these types of things. And all I could think of today, when I dropped that photograph and read the little paragraph that I wrote up about the very first gas station, and I didn't get into this because it requires its own hour podcast, is could you imagine being that guy, that family that did the very first gas station? How much foresight you had to have. You were in Pittsburgh. Henry Ford's in Detroit. So it's not like this was in Detroit. This was in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And it's Titusville, obviously, you've got that. But my point is that everybody, including his wife, probably told him he was crazy. Probably said, get into horse apple shovels. People need to pick up more horse poop. They don't need gasoline. What's this octane, petrol, and that sort of thing? People are still cranking their cars to start them and that. But could you imagine the amount of public shaming that guy took in order to foresee the future, in order to get where we're at? That's what went through my mind today.
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of resistance to change, and people felt threatened by, and automobiles were noisy and intimidating back then and scared horses. But we talked about the environment. I don't think people realize what it used to be like in cities before the advent of the automobile, when people used horses. I mean, there was huge piles of manure, and the streets were soaked with horse urine. So they weren't, and then, if they
didn't have public sewers for horses.
So
your streets were your public sewers. Yeah.
Living in a city, before automobiles existed was not as ideal as I think people tend to think.
People don't realize that New York City was one big horse slop barn for about 100 years. Like that's, no, you're exactly right, because a lot of streets were filled with not only horse urine, but people would just pee there too. They would just pee there.
So I don't know, one last historical snippet. So you pointed out the first gas station, Gulf Oil, in Pittsburgh, 1913 circa. So I get into that in the book, and Gulf Oil actually was started in the early 1900s. So you may be familiar with the Spindletop well in 1901 in South Gulf Coast of Texas. And that was like the first huge new oil strike outside the kind of Western Pennsylvania core. There had been a smaller one in Ohio, but just as the automobile industry is getting going in the early 1900s, and you mentioned Henry Ford, the Model T is introduced in 1908, and that's when more and more regular folks can afford an automobile. But Spindletop was actually, it's a whole story behind it, and I won't get into it here, but they basically needed money, and they ended up getting the Mellons out of Pittsburgh. They were bankers to fund the Spindletop well, and they basically elbowed the guy Patillo Higgins that had been drilling around there. They kind of sidelined him, and that's how Gulf Oil got started, was the Mellons out of Pittsburgh. But what's interesting is the oil there started running out fairly quickly after a few years. It was also heavy sour crude, so it was better for fuel oil. It wasn't very good for gasoline. But Gulf Oil and others like Texaco start running out. And in 1905, we had the Glenpool strike here in Oklahoma. It's just like literally miles from where I'm sitting right now. And that oil was much better for gasoline, for refining for gasoline. So Gulf Oil and Texaco built pipelines from the Gulf Coast up into the Tulsa area here where I am. And that way they could get the crude from Oklahoma down to their Gulf Coast refineries. And then they started using that, of course, around there, and then shipping fuel around to oil to the East Coast on tankers. So really interesting story, but that's kind of the background on Gulf. It's Pittsburgh bankers, but it has a connection to the Texas Gulf Coast and Oklahoma.
And where are you directing people to get the book again? It's on Amazon, right?
Amazon,
you don't have a personal website or anything like that, a landing spot like that?
Nope, just look it up on Amazon.
Hey man, bootstrapping it. That's good.
Yeah, so you mentioned podcasts. I have had several requests for an audiobook, because I've been told several times, well, I'm not really much of a reader, but I do like listening to books, or I just don't have time to read, and I drive and I work out in the gym. So I would like to do an audiobook at some point, but that's it can be pretty expensive and or time consuming. So I'm waiting for the right time on that. But for now, the paperback or the ebook. Ebook's really convenient. You can put it right on your phone and just kind of look at it when you have a chance. So
Kent Williamson is his name. American Heat Engine is the name of the book. Thank you so much for the time today, sir.
Thank you, Jason. And like I mentioned at the beginning, I love talking to a guy from North Dakota. So